Welcome back to the Dirt Show. Before we start talking about Los Angeles, I want to talk about the world's youngest and most famous hypocrite, Greta Thunberg. What a phony. What a phony. She goes on a polluting boat that's blowing all kind of black smoke into the air, flies on, jets and does everything to pollute the environment, and doesn't say a thing at all about, say, the hostages. She's never, as far as I know, called for the release of the hostages. And she's, getting on a boat to Gaza, complaining basically that the people of Hamas aren't getting dessert. Because let's be clear, nobody in Gaza is starving. If a single child had ever died of starvation, that Hamas would be carrying that child in front of every television camera. CNN would be salivating. They would be interviewing the parents. Nobody is dying of starvation. They've been claiming starvation since October 8th. The wolf, the kid that cried wolf, that's what Hamas is. Yeah, there are people who are not getting dessert, and maybe they're not getting an appetizer, but they're getting enough food to stay alive. Israel is trying their damnedest to get food in, but Hamas is shooting and trying to take the food away and use it to feed its soldiers. And that's what's been happening. And the only reason Israel has a blockade, it didn't have a blockade when it first freed Gaza. Remember, Gaza was under Israeli occupation, legitimate occupation. There had been a war with Egypt. And then Israel ended its occupation in 2005, and there was no blockade. And it's only when Hamas took over, there was a blockade to prevent the bringing in of rockets. They were bringing in thousands and thousands of rockets and shooting them at Israeli civilians, at these schools, at school buses, at synagogues. And would any country not have a blockade? Of course they would have a blockade. And Israel acted completely lawfully in having a blockade, and completely lawfully in stopping Greta Thunberg and her crew of anti-Semites from coming into Gaza. Sure, they wanted to give out some dessert and some medical supplies. Israel said, fine, we'll take the supplies through Ashdod town on the shore of Israel, just north of Gaza, and we'll distribute it. But we don't have to let you go in and make a propaganda display in Gaza. And so they've detained them, and they're going to deport them back to whatever country they came. This is the so-called Holocaust. Every Jew in the world wished there were deportations from Germany and Poland in the 1940s. Instead, there were death camps. And so Greta Thunberg is a hypocrite. She didn't condemn Hamas for its massacre. Indeed, she started condemning Israel days after the massacre. Remember, this is a woman who claims to be a feminist environmentalist. She never, as far as I can tell, once did a flotilla or anything to complain about Hamas raping women, beheading babies, killing 1,200 innocent people, capturing and holding as hostage 250 of them. No, but within days, she was calling for the end of Zionism. So there's nothing to do with what Israel is doing in Gaza now. There's nothing to do with the alleged hunger in Gaza. This has to do with her virulent anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. She's not pro-Palestinian, let's be clear. She has never called, as far as I know, for a two-state solution. I know of nobody who's been protesting Israel who called for a two-state solution. Why? Because they don't want a Palestinian state. They just want there not to be an Israel. That's their goal. They don't want a two-state solution. I challenge any one of these protesters to call for a two-state solution. If they did, they'd be thrown out of the protests, because these protests have to pass muster with Hamas. If Hamas disapproves, then they're not going to get the support, and Hamas disapproves of the two-state solution. Now, you might say, but there's a boss. There's the head of the Palestinian Authority. See what he said yesterday? He justified October 7th. He praised Hamas for producing October 7th that changed the dynamics in the Middle East for the better and all that kind of thing. That's Israel's peace partner, somebody who praises a mini Holocaust against innocent Jews. That's the situation Israel is facing. So nobody should ever confuse pro-Palestinianism. I'm pro-Palestine. I want there to be a Palestinian state living at peace side by side with a vibrant Israeli state. Yes, I'm pro-Palestinian. I'm pro-Israel. But nobody on the other side is pro-Palestinian. They're just anti-Israel. If they were pro-Palestinian, they'd be anti-Hamas. Hamas is the worst thing that's ever happened to the Palestinian people. The only reason so many Palestinians have been killed, and we'll get the true number only when the war is over, it'll be much, 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 much less than the numbers we've been fed by Hamas. My suspicion is that probably the total number of people killed is something like 40,000, not 53,000, and more than half of them are combatants. And of the remaining, more than half of those are semi-combatants, people who have used their homes to store rockets. There have been probably 10,000 purely innocent people, probably a few hundred babies and children, maybe a little bit more. But the only reason there are any babies or children who have been killed is they were killed by Hamas. They were used as human shields. Don't take my word for this. Take the word of Hamas leaders who have bragged about the fact we use our children and our women as shaheeds, as martyrs, as human shields. That's Hamas's claim, not my claim. Every time a civilian dies, a Palestinian civilian dies, Hamas cheers because it can blame it on Israel. So this is not a gray area. This is black and white. This is simple. There could have been a Palestinian state in 1938, 1947, 1948, 1967, 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007. Every time they've been offered a state, they've turned it down. That's the Palestinian leadership. I know I've met with Abbas more than once. And I know what his views are. And I know what the views are of the people around him. So don't get taken in by this. Idiots like Greta Thunberg, who probably wouldn't even know what river and what sea she was talking about, or what an intifada means. Intifada means murdering innocent people. The intifada of 2000. Remember, the intifada of 2000 followed Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak offering the Palestinians a state more than 100% of what they now had, 96% of the West Bank, 4% of Israel, capital Jerusalem, a right of return for several thousand people, and normalization. And Arafat first suggested maybe that would be possible, and then he really screwed Bill Clinton, who told me this personally, and changed his mind at the last minute, saying he would be killed if he accepted a Palestinian state. And he's probably right. The king of Jordan's great grandfather was killed when he thought about a two-state solution. Anwar Sadat was killed. And so Arafat, cared more about his own safety than he did about the rights and future of the Palestinian people. So he turned down what Bill Clinton said was the best offer anybody's ever gotten. And Bill Clinton said, when you turn down an offer like that, don't expect to get it again. And don't expect to have the claim that you're occupied. You're not occupied. If you had a chance to have a state and a chance to end the occupation, and you said no because your leader was afraid, that's not an occupation. That's just the status quo, because they could have changed the status quo, but they didn't. All right. Moving from Tel Aviv and Haifa and the Mediterranean Sea to downtown Los Angeles, we have an interesting constitutional issue. Obviously, the Constitution gives the police power in ordinary cases to the states, but it also gives the federal government powers. It requires the federal government to guarantee a Republican small r reform of government, and to obviously provide against insurrections and other kinds of invasions. And the question is whether or not what was going on in Los Angeles prior to President Trump federalizing the Guard, the National Guard, was sufficient. Look, I have to tell you again, Nostra Dershowitz prediction, the Supreme Court will not second guess the President of the United States on this issue. He will say, whether right or wrong, the President had the authority to make this decision, and he had the authority to make it over the lack of consent of the governor. And let's be clear, there was violence. You can see it on television. There were bombings and fire bombings and burnings of Teslas and other self-driving cars. There were rocks being thrown at ICE officers. There were threats against ICE officers, threats against their families. Was it a full-blown insurrection? No. And the real question, and as you know, I have a book called The Preventive State, which if any of you haven't bought it yet, shame on you. Please go on Amazon and buy The Preventive State, because you'll see it deals directly with what's going on in Los Angeles. Obviously, President Trump decided to send in the federal troops, or the federalized state militia, as a preventive measure to prevent it from getting worse. And so the question is, did he prevent it from getting worse, or did he make it worse? That's often the situation with the preventive state. When the state moves in and does something preventively, does it do more harm or does it do more good? If the United States and Israel bombed Iran and prevented it from developing a nuclear bomb, would it save millions of lives? As, for example, a preventive war in Germany in 1935 would have prevented 50 million deaths. Those are the issues I deal with in the preventive state, and those are the issues that every American cares about concerning deportation. What is deportation? It's a preventive measure. What is visa denial? A preventive measure. It used to be called exile. The king used to exile people who were threats to him so that they couldn't remain in the country. And that's what we're seeing as a modern day version of that. Again, are we deporting too many people without enough due process? Are we not deporting enough people? When the president of the United States cuts off funding from Harvard, is that a preventive measure, or is that a punitive measure? What's the line between prevention and punishment? These are all the kinds of things that I discuss in the preventive state. So please, please, please go out and buy it. As you know, the New York Times is refusing to review it because I defended President Trump. And if you're mad at the Times for refusing to review, which my best book, my most important book I ever wrote, but they won't review it. They've reviewed every book, every little book I wrote, a guidebook for young people. They reviewed it because I hadn't defended President Trump, but they didn't review anything after I defended President Trump. If you weren't mad at them, don't get mad at them. Just go out and buy the book. Make it a bestseller, and that will really sell. The New York Times refused to review a serious scholarly bestseller. It's also very readable, but it's a serious book. If they refuse to review it, by the way, and the Harvard Club, I was all scheduled to speak 2 days from now at the Harvard Club of New York. That was supposed to be my book launch. I picked the Harvard Club because I taught at Harvard 50 years, and I've been associated for 62 years with Harvard. And what happened? The Harvard Club, at the last minute, after advertising it and sending out invitations to people from all over New York City, they canceled it. They lied. They said, "Oh, well, we've been in touch with the writer, and we're working out another time." No, that it wasn't a scheduling problem. When I called them, they said they couldn't get another time. They're too busy. So it was just a lie. It's just that I was canceled. My book launch for the preventive state was canceled because I defended Donald Trump and because I criticized Harvard. That's my right. And to deny Harvard alum the opportunity to hear me speak about the preventive state because they don't like my views on Trump or my views on Harvard is just censorship. So if any of you are members of the Harvard Club of New York or any Harvard Club, write to them and tell them how outraged you are by what's going on. We don't know what the source is, whether it were local people who said, "We don't want Dershowitz, he's been, Trump," or whether it came from the top in Harvard. We don't know. There is a close association, obviously. Now, Harvard Club has a horrible reputation. As you know, it prevented women from joining. Then it allowed them to come in if they came in the back door. It certainly didn't have a good attitude toward Jews. But now, those issues have been resolved. It just doesn't have a good attitude toward people who defended the constitutional rights of Donald Trump or who criticized Harvard. So I'm not going to be able to speak at the Harvard Club. I'll never be able to speak at the Harvard Club. They'll find excuse after excuse after excuse. I'm speaking in other places, and the book's doing quite well on Amazon. But if you really want to send a message to the Harvard Club, to the New York Times to CNN to everybody who won't mention my book, please just get the book. It's not expensive and it's a good read. You'll enjoy it. It covers everything from medical intrusions, what happened during the pandemic, to the war in Iran, to bail, to you name it, deportation, everything. It's not a political book. It's an analytical book, and I think every American who cares about how to balance security and liberty would enjoy reading the book. So that's my my little commercial. I'm entitled. I'm allowed to do that because it really is aggravating that the New York Times won't review the book. Let them review it and say negative things about it. They won't. That's why they won't review it, because any reviewer would say positive things about it, the way the former president of Harvard has said positive things about it. The former justice of the Supreme Court has said positive things about it. Many academics have said positive things about it, but the New York Times does not want to say positive things about somebody who defended Donald Trump. So that's the reality in the world in which we live. Okay. Let's get back to this preventive measure. The President of the United States making a decision to federalize the National Guard and to send them in, including some Marines. So far, there have been no serious injuries or deaths resulting from that happening. We're not sure whether any serious injuries or deaths were prevented. But, I have to tell you from a political point of view, this is playing into the hands of the Republicans. Governor Newsom is acting absolutely foolishly. The American public wants to see peace on the streets of Los Angeles. They saw what happened on the streets of Los Angeles after the Rodney King case and after other cases involving alleged police brutality, the George Floyd case. By the way, let me repeat what I have said over and over again. The worst thing that has happened to America in this century, the worst thing, has been the reaction to the George Floyd killing. George Floyd was a thug and a crook and a druggie. He should never have been strangled. He should never have been killed, but he should never have been lionized and made a hero. As a result of his unfortunate death, the Black Lives Matter movement began. The Black Lives Matter movement is singularly the worst thing that's happened in America in this century. It's caused wokeness. It caused what's going on college campuses today. It caused many corporations to embrace Black Lives Matter. Black lives do matter, yes. So do white lives, so do Jewish lives, so do Muslim lives. All lives matter, and they matter equally. But the concept of Black Lives Matter, the organization, as I've said before, Eric Hoffa very aptly described what happens to causes like Black Lives Matter. Starts as a cause, all right, it's a good cause. Then it becomes a movement. Then it becomes a business. People made a lot of money. A lot of the people who were the heads of Black Lives Matter bought big homes and stole money and laundered money and did all those terrible, terrible things. And it becomes a racket. And now Black Lives Matter is a racket. It became an extortion racket. And it's caused tremendous harm to America. Some of that is happening now in the gay rights movement. I am so upset about that because I've supported gay rights in much the way I've supported Black rights. But leaders of gay rights movements now have turned anti-American, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. And, Thunberg's part of that. Thunberg says, you cannot support the environment unless you oppose Israel. What kind of nonsense is that? She loses half of her support by saying it's false. Israel has the most sensitive environmental policies of any country in the Middle East, one of the best in the world, and that's been ranked by environmental organizations. In fact, some anti-Israel people have said, they're covering up their horrors to the Palestinians by being so good on the environment, so good to gay people, so good to Black people. Remember that a very substantial number of Israelis are Black, or Black. They come from Ethiopia, and they come from other places in Africa. So African Israelis are a very important part of the population, much more than in many of the Arab countries, which have discriminated based on race and color. And so there's such hypocrisy going on. It's just absolutely amazing. So let me give you my prediction. My prediction is the lawsuits will fail. They'll work in the federal district court. You'll get, the governor of California will find a federal district judge, probably one who he was involved in appointing, and you'll get some district court judge saying, maybe even issuing an injunction, saying, oh, the president of the United States can't do this. It'll be appealed immediately. But when the case gets to the Supreme Court of the United States, they would have no choice or little choice but to hold that the judiciary cannot interfere with the discretionary judgment of an executive head of the executive branch, the president, about the necessity for sending in troops. Governor Wallace tried the same thing when Eisenhower sent federal troops and Kennedy sent federal troops in the 1950s and the 1960s. The governors were opposed to that. And some of these cases went to court, but invariably the federal government wins these cases. And although there'll be a lot of judges saying, oh, well, there's a big difference. Now the bad guys are Trump. In the old days, the good guys were Truman and Roosevelt and, Eisenhower and Kennedy. But now the bad guys are Trump and the good guys are the protesters on the street. That won't work in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will look at this institutionally and decide that institutionally the governor can't prevail over the president. And certainly the president has a good faith basis. The violence in the streets, sure, it could have been prevented by state troopers and by city police, but they didn't do it. And the presence of federal police may very well have deterred some of these thugs from coming out and burning cars. Look what happened in Minnesota. Look what happened in Oregon. Look what happened after the George Floyd killing. There were real insurrections, the burning of federal buildings, the burning of cars, and the federal government is entitled to stop that and to see that the laws be faithfully enforced as is part of the obligation of the president under Article 2 of the Constitution. All right. Let's look at some questions. I talked about that the president ought to be directing targeted denials of funding to universities and targeted denials of visas rather than broad-based. We don't want to stop the research that's going on in cancer. I got a lot of letters about that. Targeting is meaningless. Money is fungible, and the Harvard endowment has far more money than is needed for research. No, that's not actually true. Research is really, really, really expensive. And it could really eat up the Harvard endowment, which is also needed to help, finance scholarships to students. Money is not fungible. The federal government can refuse to finance the public health school, which it should, the divinity school, which it should refuse to finance, the Carr Center for Human Rights, which is a human wrongs center, and a range of other activities in the universities. Now, universities, they can divert money from that, but it sends a very important message to defund and to deny visas to people who would come into this country and create the kinds of disruptions that prevented legitimate students from going to class. Remember, it was their First Amendment rights, their academic freedom that was completely destroyed by the encampments and violent protests and the harassments that occurred. Okay. This is one about Project 65. Those are the ones who filed false bar charges against me, which I was obviously vindicated because I didn't do anything wrong. If they found your case unfounded by the Project 65, can't you go after them for the fees it took you to clear your name? No, because they didn't do it in court. They did it to the Bar Association. And as far as I know, bar associations don't have the ability to require those who bring frivolous lawsuits to pay legal expenses. I might consider suing the 65 Project Bar. I'd love to do that. I'd have to do the research and see if I have a good basis for winning. Are there no other U.S. research institutions that can conduct as good or better cancer research than woke Harvard? And the answer is probably yes. But the problem is the research is continuing. Some of these research projects have been ongoing for years. I know I have relatives who are involved in some of these research projects, and you can't just transfer them. If somebody has a lab at Harvard and they're two-thirds of the way toward a breakthrough, you can't just send the funding to another place and ask them to come over. So there would be an enormous, enormous cost in undoing or not funding research that really could contribute tremendously. This is an interesting one. I don't know if it's true, but if it's true, it tells a story. Professor, over 200 people who took the bar exam in California and who were told they failed now suddenly have been told they passed. The state Supreme Court lowered the passing score in lieu of problems with the exam. Historically, only 35% passed the exam. Now it's almost doubled to 60%. Will this destroy the professionalism of the legal profession? Look, I'm not a great fan of bar exams, but this is symptomatic of a problem. What you have is DEI. So people are selected based on improper criteria, racial criteria, rather than meritocracy. And then we inflate grades so that we can't really determine whether or not the reduction of quality can be demonstrated by results. So I'm not happy about that. Professor Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader of the House, is threatening to unmask all ICE agents, which would endanger their life. If he were to follow through with his threat, would it be a criminal act? No, it wouldn't be a criminal act, and he's immune because he's a member of Congress, but it would be stupid and terrible. Let's first unmask the protesters. Their lives aren't at stake. Maybe their jobs are at stake, and they should be at stake. People who protested Israel on October 8th, 30 Harvard groups, nobody should hire them. They're despicable people. I want to know that. I would ask any person who wanted a job with me, did you protest Israel on October 8th? You didn't even wait until the troops went in, you know. So, and if you were at a demonstration, were you masked? So I think there are unmasking issues, but it shouldn't be. Obviously, police, soldiers can have their faces. You may have to have a number that identifies you so that if you engage in misconduct, you can be brought to justice. But having their faces shown so that they can be attacked is a matter of discretion with the police department. What is your opinion of this part of the Trump-Putin discussion on Iran? Quote, I stated to President Putin that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. And on this, I believe that we were in agreement. So let's see. I mean, that would be a very good development if, in fact, President Putin went along with Trump and put pressure on Iran to allow a deal which would 100% guarantee, and that's what I would favor more than anything else, a deal that would 100% guarantee that they could never have a nuclear weapon. It would require no enrichments, complete inspections of every single facility by the United States, not by some UN phony group or, you know, even the Atomic Energy Commission. It has to be done by the United States. They have to be let into the underground facilities. They have to be let in, and it will never be 100% because they can store nuclear weapons underneath hospitals and in people's houses. So, but you know, at least it should guarantee that it's going to be much, much more difficult. The original deal, terrible deal, created by President Obama and John Kerry, both of whom were friends of mine, guaranteed that Iran would develop a nuclear bomb. So we have to undo that. I don't think that's going to come out of a deal that the Trump administration is now working on. Please disappoint me, President Trump, and demand a deal. You said just, I think today, that no enrichment. It has to go beyond that, but it has to at least say no enrichment. Now, the mullahs have said no enrichment is a deal breaker. And so remember, President also said if we don't come to an agreement, he said this today, again, there will have to be consequences. It's so important to President Trump's credibility for other deals that he do what other presidents have not done, that he stick by his word, that he doesn't become President Obama, and that he doesn't become Chamberlain, but that he is strong. And Netanyahu has to be strong. And together, Trump and Netanyahu can guarantee that Iran will never be a threat to the world, to Israel, to the United States by developing a nuclear arsenal. Let's hope that comes about. See you tomorrow.